The night was quiet, but not still. Cold air pressed down on the streets of rural Michigan, the kind of October night when frost began to lace the edges of windshields, when the air tasted sharp and metallic, and when darkness seemed to swallow whole the empty roads that cut through farmland and forest. On the screen, a timestamp appears: Friday, October 15th, 1999, 11:47 p.m. A single car hummed along County Road 12, its headlights piercing the void, its tires whispering against the frozen pavement. Inside, 20-year-old victim's name sat behind the wheel, tired after a long evening at a friend's gathering. She had laughed, hugged her friends goodbye, promised she would call when she got home. For everyone else, the night had ended. For her, it was only beginning. The drive should have taken 15 minutes, but she would never arrive. In small towns, silence has weight. Porch lights glowed faintly, dogs barked in the distance, and the autumn wind rattled the last dry leaves still clinging to skeletal branches. But here, on this stretch of road, there was nothing, no cars passing, no one watching, just a young woman, and the night pressing in. At 11:56 p.m., she pulled off onto a side road. Witnesses later recalled the distinct shape of her car near the shoulder. Some said they thought she was checking her phone. Others remembered her hazard lights flashing for only a moment. But no one stopped. No one asked if she was safe. The details that follow remain stitched together only through fragments of testimony and forensics. Her car was discovered less than an hour later, engine still warm, the driver's door cracked open to the night air. A purse rested on the passenger seat. Keys dangled from the ignition. It looked as though she had stepped out for only a moment, but she never returned. The search began quickly, neighbors waking to sirens echoing across the dark fields. Police floodlights swept across frost-tipped grass, boots crunching in ditches, voices calling her name again and again, and there, just beyond the gravel, investigators found something chilling. A trail of footprints, small, hurried, pressed deep into the frozen soil. They led away from the car, into the edge of a field. Officers followed, hearts pounding, flashlights cutting through the fog that clung low to the earth. Step after step, the prints stretched on, until, without warning, they stopped. No struggle, no blood, no continuation. Her footprints ended abruptly in the frost, as though she had simply vanished into the night. Before she became a name on flyers, before her photograph stared out from weathered missing posters, victim's name was simply a daughter, a sister, and a friend. She grew up in a modest Michigan town where everyone seemed to know one another, where the gas station attendant remembered your birthday and the church bells marked the rhythm of the seasons. Life here was ordinary: small town parades, high school football games, bonfires after dances, yet for her even the ordinary carried light. From childhood, she had a way of drawing people in. Teachers remembered her quick smile, friends remembered the way she stayed late after practice to walk others home, and family remembered her laughter, a sound that filled their small kitchen and clung to the walls like warmth in winter. She had dreams too. She wanted to study nursing, to help people, to build something larger than herself. On the margins of her notebooks, she scribbled plans for the future, her handwriting looping with certainty. Her family still remembers the little details, the way she left her shoes by the back door, the scent of vanilla lotion on her coat, the stack of cassette tapes she kept in the car for long drives. These fragments, so small, so ordinary, became monumental after she was gone, because absence makes even the mundane sacred. Michigan, in the late 1990s, was a place caught between eras. The factories still stood, though many whispered about jobs disappearing. Downtown streets lined with mom-and-pop stores were slowly being overshadowed by strip malls. But in this town, community still mattered. It was a place where front doors were rarely locked, where neighbors trusted one another. Safe, or so they thought. That's what made her disappearance cut so deeply. The idea that someone so loved, so rooted in this town, could simply vanish. It was unthinkable. People clung to hope in those early days, convincing themselves she must have wandered off, that she'd call home soon, embarrassed by some misunderstanding, because the alternative was too dark to imagine. Her parents, especially, carried that weight. Her mother, who once rushed to fold warm laundry for her daughter, returning home from school, now folded clothes that would never be worn again. Her father, who had promised to protect his little girl from every harm, now faced the unbearable truth that some dangers cannot be shielded against. Friends described her as the kind of person who never left without saying goodbye, who checked on people when they were hurting. To lose someone like that, it hollowed the town. Candlelight vigils filled the church lawn, hymns rising into the cold air. Photographs of her, smiling in graduation robes, sitting cross-legged on the grass, laughing with friends, were held up as reminders of the life that once was. No one could have guessed, standing in those circles of flickering light, that this case would haunt them for the next 20 years, that her name would echo in detective briefings, in whispered conversations at the diner, in family prayers said through tears. Her story was supposed to be simple, a life unfolding, a future unwritten. Instead, it became a question without an answer, and as the days turned into weeks, unease began to spread through the streets of her hometown. If she could vanish, so could anyone. The evening began like countless others. Friends gathered, laughter spilling into the air, the last fragile days of autumn holding back the inevitable bite of winter. For victim's name, it was supposed to be nothing more than a casual night, a small get-together after work, familiar faces, music drifting from an old stereo, the comfort of belonging. At 9:15 p.m., she was seen talking with a co-worker outside the front porch, her breath visible in the chill. At 9:47, someone remembered her laughing in the kitchen, a soda can in hand. By 10:30, she hugged two friends goodbye, promising to call them the next morning. The moment seemed unremarkable at the time. Only later would each recollection be dissected like evidence, as though in their details a hidden truth might surface. Witness accounts would later contradict each other. Some swore she looked distracted, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Others said she was perfectly fine, upbeat, even radiant, which was true. No one could be certain. What is certain is this: at 11:20 p.m., she left the gathering. She stepped into the cold night, climbed into her car and drove away. A neighbor remembered the crunch of tires on gravel, the glow of tail lights shrinking into the dark. That was the last time anyone would see her alive. Police reconstruction would later map her final movements almost minute by minute. The winding roads of rural Michigan stretched ahead, empty and silent. The clock ticked forward. 11:32 p.m., her car passed a gas station security camera, headlights cutting through the fog. 11:41, a driver recalled seeing a vehicle like hers parked briefly at a stop sign, lingering too long, as though the driver hesitated. And then something changed. At 11:56 p.m., a witness driving past County Road 12 reported seeing a car pulled to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. The description matched hers. But when questioned, the driver admitted he did not stop. In a small town, people trusted that things were safe, that nothing sinister could happen on familiar roads. By 12:17 a.m., her parents noticed the absence. She had not called, had not returned home. They told themselves it was nothing. Maybe she stayed later than planned. But unease grew quickly. Calls went unanswered. At 12:41 a.m., everything shifted. A county deputy on patrol discovered her car, abandoned on the roadside, the engine still warm, the driver's door slightly open, keys in the ignition, purse untouched on the seat. A haunting stillness lingered, as though the world itself had paused in that moment. Inside, nothing suggested a struggle, no broken glass, no torn fabric, no blood. The car was neat, orderly, untouched. Yet outside, the story changed. In the faint frost clinging to the soil, the deputy spotted prints, her prints, moving away from the vehicle, uneven and hurried. Officers would later count the impressions, measuring each step, following them into the dark, and then nothing. The trail simply ended. It was as though she had been swallowed by the night. How does someone vanish from a roadside in under an hour? How does a life full of promise dissolve into silence, with no one to see, no one to hear, no one to stop it? These questions would become the heartbeat of the investigation, echoing through every file, every interview, every sleepless night for years to come. And in those first early hours, panic began to spread. The night she vanished, the town was thrust into a storm of confusion. What began as a routine missing person call escalated within hours into a full-scale search. Squad cars lined the desolate road where her vehicle sat abandoned. Red and blue lights pulsed across the fields, casting eerie flashes onto the frosted grass. The hum of police radios filled the cold air. Deputies swept the immediate area first, their flashlights cutting wide arcs into the fields, shouting her name into the silence. Dogs were brought in before dawn, noses pressed to the ground, handlers straining to catch even the faintest trace of her scent. For a while hope flickered, but the trail led only as far as the footprints had shown, fading abruptly into nothing, as if she had evaporated. By morning word had spread. Neighbors who normally slept through the night were jolted awake by the sound of helicopters overhead. Volunteers poured in, church members, factory workers, teenagers wrapped in borrowed jackets. They formed lines across cornfields and ditches, marching in step, scanning every inch of earth. The search grid expanded mile by mile, but no sign of her emerged. Inside the sheriff's office, chaos reigned. Phones rang endlessly, each new tip adding more noise than clarity. Detectives scribbled notes on yellow legal pads, pinned maps to the walls, and tried to piece together the timeline. Every hour that passed made the situation more dire. The first interviews began almost immediately. Friends from the gathering were questioned, their recollections catalogued and compared. Some remembered her leaving in good spirits. Others insisted she seemed uneasy. Police tried to reconcile the contradictions, but the picture remained hazy. Co-workers, neighbors, ex-boyfriends, all were asked to account for their whereabouts that night. The questions grew sharper, more pointed. Rumors began to trickle in, whispers of troubled relationships, of jealousies, of secrets never shared openly. Mistakes were made in those frantic first days. The car, her last known refuge, became a contested site. Too many hands moved through it before the crime scene was fully secured. Evidence, if it had existed, may have been lost forever. Tire tracks near the roadside were trampled over by rescuers' boots. Cigarette butts that might have belonged to someone else were thrown away as trash. In the rush to find her, procedure slipped. Meanwhile, the community was unraveling. The diner buzzed with speculation. At the bar, patrons whispered theories into their beers. Every face became suspicious, every gesture scrutinized. Parents clutched their children tighter, locking doors that had never been locked before. In towns like this, nothing stayed hidden for long, except the truth. And through it all, her family stood at the center of the storm. Her mother clung to hope, insisting she must be alive somewhere, waiting to be found. Her father grew restless, pacing the floors, unable to sleep. Reporters camped on their lawn, cameras flashing, voices demanding comment, but no words could capture the abyss they had fallen into. For investigators, pressure mounted quickly. State police joined the effort, bringing more resources, more manpower. Still, the case yielded nothing concrete. No eyewitnesses, no usable forensic evidence, no clear motive. And yet, there was one lingering thought that no one dared to say aloud, at least not then, because in the frantic blur of interviews and searches, a name surfaced, a person who knew her well, a person dismissed at first, considered impossible, someone police would turn back to years later, when the trail had gone cold. But in 1999, no one could see that far ahead. For now the investigation was chaos, In small towns, silence doesn't last long. By the end of the first week, the search for victims' name had shifted from frantic mobilization to something quieter, darker. Whispers carried on the cold autumn wind. At the diner, waitresses refilled coffee cups, while customers lowered their voices, speculating about who could have done it. At the high school football bleachers, parents clustered in uneasy groups, eyes darting, the game on the field forgotten. At the local bar, talk grew sharp, fueled by beer and fear. What if it was someone we know? Suspicion became contagious. Some pointed fingers at her circle of friends. Who was the last to see her alive? Who left the party when she did? Rumors twisted recollections until facts blurred. An innocent hug became strange behavior. A missed phone call became a sign of guilt. In the absence of answers, imagination filled the void. Others whispered about her ex-boyfriend, a young man still living in town. He told police he had been home that night, asleep, but in the community's eyes, his history with her cast a long shadow. Did jealousy linger? Did anger flare? Theories multiplied, and with them distrust. He couldn't walk into the grocery store without feeling eyes follow him, every step marked by suspicion. Even those who offered help found themselves under scrutiny. Volunteers who joined search parties later noticed the sideways glances, the subtle questions. Why are you so eager? What are you hiding? The very act of caring became suspicious. It wasn't just the living who spoke. Old stories were unearthed. Incidents long buried dragged back into daylight. People recalled disputes, late-night arguments, odd encounters that suddenly seemed sinister in hindsight. Memory, fallible and flawed, became evidence in the court of gossip. For detectives, the rumors were a double-edged sword. Each tip demanded follow-up. Each whisper recorded and filed, but most led nowhere. One day it was a neighbor who saw a suspicious truck. The next it was a co-worker who claimed she'd been stalked. None of it held. Each dead end drained resources, time and morale. Still, the gossip served another purpose. It revealed the growing fracture in the town itself. Neighbors who once borrowed sugar now eyed one another with suspicion. Friends who once shared secrets now withheld words, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Fear gnawed at the fabric of trust, and beneath all of it, one question pulsed, unspoken but constant. What if the killer is here, living among us? Parents kept their daughters close. Locking doors became routine. Nights grew quieter, as if the whole town held its breath. Even the landscape seemed altered. The same empty roads, the same bare trees, but now shadowed with dread. Every sound in the dark could be a threat. Every face could be hiding something. In those early months, no one could escape it. At church, her name was spoken in every prayer. At school, teachers tried to keep students focused, but the empty desk at the back of the classroom loomed larger than any lesson. At her home, the porch light remained on through the night, a beacon of hope, or perhaps a plea, but hope was not enough. The whispers grew sharper, rumors thicker, and the longer the case dragged on without resolution, the more dangerous those suspicions became, because the truth was still buried. And the real perpetrator, unknown to everyone, moved quietly through the same streets, blending into the same crowds. What if the killer was among them all along? As the weeks stretched into months, the case no longer felt like just another file on a detective's desk. It became an obsession. Detective Mark Henderson, a veteran of the county sheriff's department, still remembers the first night he stood by the abandoned car. The frost glittered under the floodlights, his breath hanging in the air as he studied the open driver's door. Something about the scene refused to let go. He had worked dozens of missing person reports before, but this one felt different. It clung to him. In the cramped office downtown, cardboard boxes began to pile high. Each one held fragments of her life. Photographs, witness statements, cassette tapes of interviews. The boxes multiplied, spilling into corners, filling cabinets. Cigarette smoke curled through the air late at night, as detectives pored over reports.
red pens circling inconsistencies, yellow highlighters marking possible leads. On the whiteboard, her name was written in block letters. Beneath it, a timeline stretched out, annotated with dates, sightings, rumors, and still the gaps yawned wide. For Henderson and his partner, the work consumed everything. Days blurred into nights. They drove the same country roads over and over, replaying her last known route as if the asphalt itself might reveal a secret. They sat through hours of interviews, asking the same questions, searching for a crack in someone's story. Every night, they left the office only to return in the morning, eyes bloodshot, minds still racing. The case began to take a toll. Henderson's marriage strained under the weight of his absence. His partner grew quieter, more withdrawn, carrying the frustration of too many dead ends. But neither could let it go. Some cases fade, gathering dust. This one refused. The victim's face stared back at them from pinned photographs. Graduation smile, family vacation, candid snapshots with friends. Her presence lingered in every report, every unanswered question. She was not a stranger to them anymore. She was someone they carried. Detectives began to talk about the case in whispers, even outside the office, over coffee, in grocery store aisles, on sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling. It haunted them. Each year the case grew colder. Evidence sat sealed in boxes. Leads withered. Witnesses' memories faded, eroded by time. Yet still, they returned, pulling open the same files, chasing the same faint trails. It wasn't just duty anymore. It was something deeper, a refusal to let her story be forgotten. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the office was still, and the only sound was the ticking of the clock, Henderson would find himself staring at her photograph, asking questions into the silence. Where had she gone? Who had taken her? And why? Answers never came, but the obsession never left. The longer the case lingered without answers, the more desperate the search became. And with desperation came noise. Tips poured in from across Michigan, each one promising revelation, each one demanding attention. Detectives followed them all, because what if the one they ignored held the truth? Psychics appeared on television, waving maps and claiming visions of her final resting place. One insisted she lay near water, another said she was buried beneath a barn. Cameras captured their predictions, families clung to them, and officers reluctantly trudged through muddy riverbanks and abandoned farmhouses. Every time, nothing. Prison informants too, lined up with stories. A cellmate swore another inmate had confessed to the crime. Another promised knowledge of a secret burial site in exchange for a reduced sentence. Detectives drove hours to interview them, recording every word, only to discover the tales collapsed under scrutiny. Lies told for leverage, nothing more. And then there were the false confessions. Men walked into precincts across the state, claiming responsibility for her disappearance. Some were troubled souls craving attention, others were drifters, hoping for notoriety. None had details that matched, none could explain the evidence. Still, each confession had to be checked, logged, disproven. Another thread that led nowhere. The media amplified every twist. Headlines proclaimed break in the case, only for the leads to dissolve days later. News anchors speculated, experts weighed in, and the public hung on every false promise. Hope rose and fell like a cruel tide, battering the family, exhausting the detectives. For investigators, the weight grew unbearable. Every dead end meant more hours wasted, more resources drained. But the alternative, ignoring a lead, was unthinkable. They couldn't risk missing the truth. So the cycle continued. Tip pursuit, disappointment. Again and again, as the years passed, the trail grew colder still. Witnesses moved away, memories blurred, evidence degraded. The search that once consumed hundreds dwindled to a handful of detectives, revisiting files in silence. By 2005, 6 years after her disappearance, The case had become a graveyard of false hopes. Henderson and his team kept the boxes stacked in their office, each one heavier with failure. Nights stretched longer, their questions sharper. How had they failed to find her? How could someone vanish so completely? The community too grew weary. Candled vigils attracted fewer people. The whispers softened, replaced by resignation. Her name still carried weight, but it felt more like a wound than a living mystery. And then for nearly a decade, the silence became total. No new leads, no breakthroughs, no answers, just an empty space where a young woman's life should have been, and a case file gathering dust in the archives of a small Michigan town. Years passed, the seasons turned, autumns to winters, winters to springs, and still there was nothing new. The investigations, once frantic, quietly stalled. Files sat in drawers. Evidence boxes were sealed. The trail grew faint, then colder. Hope flickered, dimmed, then nearly burned out. Her family lived with that coldness every day. Her mother kept the guest bedroom exactly as it was the night she vanished. Fuzzy slippers by the bed, an unmade quilt on the spare mattress, the curtains drawn just so. Every morning she made her coffee, paused at the doorway, remembered, then carried on as though the empty room was simply waiting for a return that would never happen. Holidays became hollow rituals. Thanksgiving, when laughter should fill the house, echoed with silence in the spaces where she once sat. Birthdays came and went, marked only by cake candles blown out in whispered wishes. Years without cards, without phone calls, without footsteps across the porch at dusk. The calendar itself felt like a taunt. Her father, confronted with the open wound of absence, learned to become two people at once: the stoic provider, demanding normalcy at home, the broken man who sometimes wept in the dark, unable to guard his grief from the ceiling's cold stare. He kept her childhood drawings in a drawer, photos in a box under the bed. He checked the front porch nightly. He wondered, as the months turned into years, whether she was alive somewhere, stranded or gone forever.
Siblings, friends, classmates moved forward with their lives, graduation, marriage, babies, and yet some moments always froze. Her sister, returning home for Christmas, would linger in her room, inhaling the scent of her shampoo lingering on the pillow. Her best friend continued to set a place for her at dinner, in case she should walk in. The community watched, her name still spoken in prayers. Vigils held each anniversary of her disappearance under flickering candlelight in the yard of her home. Neighbors offered their condolences, but time's passage made sorrow a quiet thing. The bright flame of early urgency dimmed to a dull ember of remembrance. Investigators reassigned, detectives retired. The sheriff, who once stood on the roadside under floodlights, watching her footprints vanish into dwarfing darkness, grew older. New officers took over the file, young faces with fresh eyes, but always confronted the same blank spaces. The case was officially considered cold. Investigative leads dried up. Witnesses moved away or died. Paper reports yellowed. Forensics, which in 1999 were cutting edge, were now outdated, dormant. Still, hope refused to leave her parents. They petitioned police each year for renewed attention. They filed new requests, followed up on any tip, no matter how small. They kept the newspaper clippings. They talked to reporters. Occasionally a letter arrived in the mail, from someone claiming knowledge, claiming guilt, claiming just a memory, and their hearts surged, then sank again when the claims could not be substantiated. Emotionally, the weight of waiting exacted a toll. Her mother's laughter grew rare. Her father's sleep was restless. Her siblings carried guilt, even though they had nothing to do with the disappearance. Guilt that they were alive, that life went on, that she was not there to share it. Guilt for forgetting what her favorite song was. Guilt for replacing her shoes. Guilt for adapting without recognizing how hollow all change felt. They built routines around her absence. A chair at the table left empty but dusted. A birthday cake with one candle left unlit. A yearly prayer said, not for closure, but for any truth. A sign, a whisper, simple confirmation that they were not forgotten. And yet grief morphed into something else. Vigilance. The family's loss sharpened them. They watched news reports. They visited cold case units. They learned forensics. They refused to settle into peace until someone, somewhere, answered the question she could not. How do you grieve when hope still flickers? In the cold, the absence became her presence, the silence her voice. And in every frozen morning, in every shadowed evening, they lived between what was lost and what still might be. 2 decades had passed. For 20 years, the case file remained sealed inside metal cabinets, aging with dust. Detectives had long since rotated out. Families had lived with absence for so long it hardened into a second skin. Most believed the truth might never come. But then, against all odds, the silence cracked. It began with the Michigan State Police cold case team. Advances in forensic science, especially in DNA profiling, had transformed the landscape. Technology that did not exist in 1999 was now precise enough to lift evidence from traces once considered useless. Detectives pulled the old boxes from storage. Inside, beneath stacks of interviews and photographs, lay items collected that night: fibers, soil samples, cigarette butts, scraps too small to test at the time. Now those relics had stories to tell. One sample, preserved meticulously, revealed a DNA profile. It was run through CODIS, the national database of offenders. At first no match. But investigators pressed on, using genetic genealogy, the same method that had solved dozens of once impossible cases across America. Through painstaking work, analysts built a family tree from the DNA, narrowing possibilities, tracing connections. What once was a sprawling puzzle now pointed to a name: Jerome Henry, a man with a history of violence, living just miles from where she vanished. Henry was no stranger to law enforcement. He had priors: burglary, assault, attempted abduction, crimes that whispered escalation. But at the time of her disappearance, no one had connected him. He had slipped under the radar, another face in a crowded suspect pool. Now the evidence placed him squarely in the frame. Detectives reopened the case formally in 2019. They tracked Henry, gathered new evidence, interviewed associates. His past unraveled under scrutiny. Old acquaintances recalled his temper. Former partners spoke of violence, control, and sudden disappearances. Witnesses remembered him driving through the very roads where she was last seen. Bit by bit, the picture sharpened. Finally, in 2020, investigators confronted Henry. They laid out the evidence: DNA linked to her belongings, corroborated by witness testimony, reinforced by his criminal history. He denied, he deflected. But the weight was overwhelming. The arrest made headlines across Michigan: cold case breakthrough, man arrested in 1999 disappearance. For her family, the news was shattering and relieving all at once. After 20 years of silence, they finally had a name, a face, a man who might explain the nightmare that had consumed their lives. The community, too, rilled. People who had whispered about the case for decades now spoke openly. Vigils reignited. Neighbors remembered where they were that night in 1999, how they searched the woods, how they prayed. Detectives called it a miracle of persistence and science. Without genetic genealogy, they admitted, Henry may never have been found. The case that once seemed destined for permanent obscurity was alive again. For the family, though, the breakthrough was not closure. It was a reopening. Because while the arrest answered who, it still left the deeper ache, where her body had never been recovered. Even as Henry awaited trial, the family's vigil continued. They demanded answers, pleaded for a location, begged to bring her home. Investigators searched new sites, dredged fields, excavated soil, guided by tips that surfaced after his arrest. And yet 2 decades later, the ground remained silent. Still, after 20 years, the coldest of cases had cracked. Justice at last was in reach. When the name was finally announced, it struck like a thunderclap: Jerome Henry. To the wider public, it was a name that meant little, just another man, another face. But to those who lived in that Michigan town, the revelation cut deep. Henry had never been a stranger. He was the man who sat at the corner of the local diner, sipping black coffee and chatting with truckers. The one who volunteered now and then for small-town projects, clearing brush along the roadside, fixing fences. A man who blended in so perfectly that no one ever thought to look closer. The shock was immediate, because Jerome Henry had been hiding in plain sight. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, maybe even friendly, though some admitted there was always something unsettling in his eyes. Others recalled moments that seemed minor at the time, the way he lingered near the high school football games, though he had no children on the team, the late-night drives when his car's headlights sliced through empty rural roads. But none of it had seemed enough, not then. Not until the DNA told a different story. Police unearthed details that painted a disturbing portrait. Henry had a long history of violence, arrests for assault, restraining orders from women who described him as volatile, unpredictable. Each charge had faded into the background, overshadowed by plea deals and lack of evidence. He had been close, but never quite caught. And yet in October 1999, he had crossed an invisible line. Investigators now believed Henry had been prowling that night, driving those same back roads the victim traveled home on. He knew the terrain. He knew how to vanish into its shadows. The evidence suggested he intercepted her, forced her off the road, and into his vehicle. The betrayal was staggering, because Henry was not some outsider drifting into town. He was part of it. He had sat in pews at church, walked the aisles of the grocery store, nodded at parents in Little League bleachers. He had attended the very vigils held in her honor, standing shoulder to shoulder with the grieving, while knowing exactly what had happened. It was a chilling performance, a mask of normalcy. For her family, the reveal reopened wounds. Photographs were pulled from dusty boxes. They realized he had been there. In the background of community gatherings, a faint figure in snapshots of the very search efforts launched to find her. Reporters swarmed. Old footage surfaced of Henry in his younger days, smiling casually at a community event. The split-screen images, the clean-shaven man in a collared shirt beside his present-day mugshot, hollow-eyed and hardened, became symbols of betrayal. How had no one seen him for what he was? That question rippled through every conversation in town. Was it willful blindness? Was it fear? Or was Henry simply skilled at hiding the darkness within? Detectives, too, wrestled with disbelief. For years they had chased red herrings, interrogated suspects who seemed more promising, and all along the answer had been so close. They had even questioned Henry in the early days. Briefly, he had been calm, cooperative, unremarkable. There was nothing then to hold him, and so he slipped back into the shadows. Now, with DNA tying him to the crime, the truth was unavoidable. The predator had not come from the outside. He had lived among them, invisible in plain sight. And as his name spread across news broadcasts, a chilling reality set in. If Jerome Henry could hide for 20 years, what else had gone unnoticed? The reveal was more than shocking. It was destabilizing. It shattered the illusion of safety in small-town Michigan. It reminded everyone that evil does not always wear a mask of menace. Sometimes, it wears the face of a neighbor. But shock was only the beginning, because once his identity was unmasked, the next step came quickly. Arrest, interrogation, and eventually, the unraveling of the truth he had tried to bury for 2 decades. The arrest unfolded on a gray October morning in 2020. The chill in the air mirrored the tension as unmarked vehicles rolled quietly into the neighborhood where Jerome Henry had built a modest life. He was older now, grayer, slower, carrying the wear of years lived in concealment. But when officers surrounded his house, weapons drawn, there was no escape left. Neighbors watched from windows as Henry was led away in handcuffs. For them it was the end of a mystery that had haunted their streets for decades. For the family of the victim, it was the moment they had both prayed for and dreaded. Inside the interrogation room, Henry's mask began to crack. Detectives placed the evidence in front of him, the DNA match, the testimony, the reconstructed timeline. At first he denied. He claimed the DNA must have been a mistake, that he had never known her, never crossed paths with her. But the walls were closing in.
Hours turned into days. The silence between questions stretched long. Detectives pressed him on inconsistencies, on the memories he tried to dodge. Slowly the bravado eroded. His shoulders slumped, his gaze fell, and then in a low, fractured voice, Henry confessed. The words were chilling. He described how he had seen her that night, alone, driving home, how he followed, how he forced her to stop. He spoke without emotion, recounting the abduction as if it were routine. His tone was flat, mechanical, as though he were recounting errands rather than a young woman's final moments. For detectives it was both victory and horror. The confession confirmed what they long suspected, but the details were darker than they imagined. He admitted to taking her to a remote wooded area. He admitted to violence, to silencing her pleas. He admitted to burying what was left beneath the Michigan soil. Yet when pressed on the exact location, Henry grew vague, almost evasive. He claimed memory had faded, that 2 decades blurred the lines. Search teams were dispatched to areas he mentioned, combing through forests, digging into frozen ground, but the precise spot remained elusive. Even with confession, the family's most desperate question, where she lay, remained unanswered. The trial moved swiftly once charges were filed. The courtroom was filled with a silence so heavy, it seemed to suffocate. Family members sat clutching photographs, reminders of the girl whose smile had been frozen in time. Prosecutors laid out the DNA evidence, the confession, the decades of hidden violence. Defense attorneys tried to cast doubt, to question memory and procedure, but the tide was unstoppable. When the jury returned, the verdict was clear, guilty on all counts. The family wept, the community exhaled. After 20 years justice had spoken. At sentencing, the judge's voice was unwavering as he delivered life without parole. Henry showed little reaction, his expression unreadable, as though even in that moment he remained locked behind his own walls. But in the gallery, sobs broke the silence. Relief and grief mingled, a release of years of waiting. The case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved had found resolution, yet resolution did not mean peace. The truth was darker than anyone had dared imagine, and though the guilty man was behind bars, the absence remained. An empty chair at family dinners, a bedroom preserved in hope, a name whispered through tears. The justice system had spoken. The monster was unmasked, tried and caged. But for those who loved her, the haunting truth lingered. Closure was not absolute. And as reporters filed their last stories from the courthouse steps, one final question lingered. After all the evidence, after all the confessions, would her family ever be able to bring her home? The trial had ended, the verdict delivered. Jerome Henry would never walk free again. For the courts the story was closed, but for the people who lived through it, the aftermath was only beginning. In Michigan, autumn bled slowly into winter. Snow covered the ground like a shroud, softening the edges of a community still raw with shock. For the victim's family, the change of seasons only marked another cycle of grief. Life without her had become routine, but the truth of her final hours tore open wounds that had scarred over in silence. Her mother still kept her bedroom intact. Posters on the wall, a half-read book on the nightstand, a perfume bottle capped but never emptied. Every year on her birthday, candles were lit. Some years the vigils drew crowds, filling church halls and front lawns with flickering light. Other years, only the family remained, huddled close against the night air, whispering her name. Now with Henry's conviction, people spoke of closure, but closure is a word that can wound as much as it heals. For her parents, justice in a courtroom could never replace the child they lost. "We have answers," her mother once said, "but we still don't have her." The absence of a body lingered like unfinished business. Detectives pledged to keep searching, combing the woods where Henry hinted at her burial. Each failed dig left the family in limbo. Hope clashed with despair. They had the truth, but not the homecoming they longed for. The community too bore its scars. For 20 years suspicion had fractured trust. Neighbors had whispered about neighbors. Friendships had broken under the strain of suspicion. Now the knowledge that the predator had lived quietly among them left a hollow ache. Some admitted guilt for not noticing the warning signs. Others simply feared what it meant, that evil could hide behind familiar faces. For the detectives, the case became part of their legacy. Some retired shortly after, worn down by years of chasing ghosts. Others remained, carrying the lesson forward: never let a file gather dust, never assume silence means the end. The cold case unit became a symbol of persistence, proof that no matter how much time passes, justice can still be found. Journalists would later write that the case was less about one man's darkness, and more about the resilience of those left behind. A mother who refused to give up, detectives who carried the weight of unanswered questions through decades, a community that even fractured, kept her memory alive. And yet even in the resolution, there is unease, because her story is not just about one crime in one Michigan town. It is about time, and the way it erodes certainty. It is about the fragile balance between memory and forgetting, and the long shadows cast when justice is delayed. On the anniversary of her disappearance, 2 decades after she first walked into the night and never returned, the family gathered once more. Snow fell gently, the sound muffled, as if the world itself paused in respect. Candles flickered in glass jars, their flames bending against the wind. The crowd bowed their heads. In the front row her mother spoke softly: "She is not just a case file, she is our daughter, and we will carry her with us always." It was a reminder that even as the system closed its books, the story lived on in the hearts of those who loved her. The final images are not of a courtroom, nor of a prison cell, but of a family standing beneath the Michigan sky, their breath rising in the cold night air, holding on to memory, because in the end, justice is never the full measure. Justice cannot rewind time. It cannot bring back laughter echoing through a family home. It cannot erase the silence that follows a tragedy. But justice can reveal truth. Justice can unmask the hidden. Justice can carve light into the deepest shadows. And so the story ends where it began, in Michigan, where the snow falls heavy, covering the earth in white silence. Snow melts, seasons turn, but the shadows remain. The narrator's final words echo like the closing of a prayer. In Michigan, the snow always melts, but some shadows never fade.